Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Mike Fernandez with Arpent Realty. This is the third video in a 5-video series about getting started in real estate. The 4 problems you're going to need to solve if you want to be a good real estate investor, right? If you want to be in it for the long term, if you want to be investing for 20, 30 years, right? These are the 4 problems that you're going to need to get good at solving so you don't quit or fail, right? So video 1 was just kind of talking an overview of what the series is. We talked at a high level about each one of these and how they fit together. Video 2, the last one, we talked about problem number 1, which is finding a deal. In my opinion, that's the most important one because without that, nothing else works, right? You need the deal to have any of the other problems don't apply to you if you don't have a deal, right? So number 1 was find the deal. We talked about on market, off market, network, and all those things. Today, we're talking about buy the deal. So we're talking about the financing, right? The next video is going to be funding it, meaning cash and stuff like that. But this is specifically the financing side of the deal. What options are out there? What type of financing works best? I'm really excited to dive into this one because I think this is where a lot of misconceptions come from. So without further ado, let's dive on in and let's talk about financing. All right, so let's see if it clicks over here. Okay, so financing the deal, there are tons of different options out there. And I think probably the best way that I can walk through a lot of these is to talk through my own journey of real estate investing, how we got started, what are some of the ones we've done, what are some of the positives and negatives, right? And I think we're going to hit on the vast majority of these, and then I'll kind of talk through the difference after that. But I want to be very upfront here. This is probably not all inclusive, right? That's one of the cool things about real estate is there's so many ways to tackle every problem. The same is true here, right? This is not all inclusive. I'm sure somebody in the comments is going to say, "Oh, you forgot about this." Probably so, right? But these are the main ones for a newbie. If you're just starting out, I think this is a good illustration of what's all out there and some avenues that might pique your interest, right? So let's start up here at the top left, owner occupied. For me, if you are a brand new investor, and the big thing here, the big filter point, if you are willing to live in the property, which I highly recommend. Look, I could do an entire video series, right? An entire 8-part video series on how house hacking is the ultimate real estate investing strategy for newbies, right? I truly believe that down to my bones. But look, if you are willing to live in the property, this is the absolute best way to get started because you can get these owner-occupied loans, and they call this house hacking, right? Move in one unit, rent out the others. Listen, FHA, VA, and conventional owner-occupied loans, you can get up to a 4-unit property. You can buy a 4-plex, which we have done, right? We bought a 4-plex on a VA loan with 0 down. So that is a 4-plex, nothing down, nothing out of pocket. And then we've also bought an FHA loan. We bought a duplex on an FHA loan, right? So you can use these owner-occupied loans that have typically better interest rates, and they typically always have way lower down payment requirements than any of the conventional stuff, right? Than traditional investors, short-term loans, investor loans, all that stuff. Look, if you are starting out, limited cash, want to get your foot in the door, and I think one important caveat here too is you need to have, this has to be a long-term perspective, right? Because you're putting less up front, so you're going to want to stick with it for the long term, right? But it's a way where you can take for most people, their most expensive line item on their personal budget, which is housing, and use it as a way to invest in real estate, right? So a real world example of that is you buy a $200,000 duplex. 3.5% of that is going to be let's say $7,000. We get the seller to pay for the buyer agent commission and the closing costs, which is totally reasonable in this market, right? So you're talking $7,000 out of pocket to buy this duplex, right? You rent out the other side. That's going to pay probably the vast majority of your mortgage. Most times when I do this math for people, it comes out to where their portion of the mortgage is between $800 to $1,000. Now, there's a lot of fluctuation in what the rents are or how much you're paying, all that stuff, but generally that's where it lands. So you're not only are you dropping your monthly housing note because you're not going to rent anything nice for $800 to $1,000, right? But you're also starting to build wealth, and you live there for 1 year, and then guess what? You can rinse and repeat, or then you go buy your white picket fence house, wherever it is you want to live in, right? And now you have an investment property. and it only costs you $7,000 out of pocket. And I talk to people who they might have saved up 20%, right? But I tell them, do this anyway, because instead of taking your entire nest egg and dropping it into one property, if you're willing to do this and take your time and do one every year, that same 20% down might buy you 2 or 3 properties, right? The down payment of it. Now, look, there is caveats there, right? Like the bank doesn't want you to go backwards in a sense. Like you can't go from a new construction 3-bedroom duplex and then say you're going to house hack a 1-bedroom fourplex. They're not going to let that happen. So there are ways to strategize it, and there are ways to go about it. But if you're starting out, to me, that's one of the best ways you can get started. And I should have led with this, but one of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to real estate is that I need 20% down. And that is not always the case. I have literally never put 20% down. We bought and sold. I can't even tell you how many loans or how many properties, how many loans we've got. I have never put 20% down, ever. There are tons of different options. So we started with owner occupied because that's how we got started, right? We did it with that fourplex. We did it with the duplex. And we did it again with a single family home. None of those we brought more than 3.5% up front, right? The VA loan, the fourplex, we actually got money back at closing because we got all the rents, we got all the deposits, and the seller covered everything because it was a little bit distressed. It needed a little bit of work. So that's that one. Then you have traditional investor, and this is where we kind of transitioned into, right? This is back, I was doing real estate investing. I was a realtor, but I still had a W-2 job. So banks loved me, right? I had lots of good income, not a ton of debt. And so this one here on the top right, banks love that. So if you're in that boat, if you are still working your W-2 job, but wanting to get into real estate, this is your bread and butter, right? You may need, if you're not moving into it, you may need the 20% down, or you could do a refi or something like that. But you're going to get decent rates on this one. It is going to be based on your credit, your income, your debt to income ratio, all of those things. But it's going to be a better product for you long term versus somebody who needs to do a DSCR or a portfolio loan or a private money or something like that, right? So great for long term holds. If you are a slow and steady, which I can relate to, right? It's typically me. I'm going to buy this thing and I'm going to own it for 15, 20, 30 years. Phenomenal route, especially if you have a W-2. I can't do those anymore. I write off, my accountant is phenomenal. I write off everything I possibly can to be legal, right? Or within the constraints of the law. But so we can't do those anymore. The bank looks at us and says your debt to income ratio is 10,000%, or like whatever's bad. And I'm like, listen, that's not true. We make decent money. We just write everything off. But the banks don't want to hear that, right? They look at the taxes, and I want to pay little taxes, so we show little income, right? So once you get to that certain point, it gets very tough to do those, and you'll hear a lot of investors talk about that, which is why they pivot down here, these investor loans. Now, a DSCR loan is called debt service coverage ratio, right? What that is, the bank says, hey, this asset, this property is going to be the borrower in terms of qualification. So they are still going to look at your credit, but in my experience, they generally don't care about income. Sometimes, depending on it is, they might do like bank statement loans, right? Let's say you're a contractor who writes everything off, but you got a ton of money. They might do it based on bank statements, or they might do it based on the performance of the property itself. So they're just going to look, hey, is this a credit-worthy individual? Is this credit decent? Usually in the upper 6s, low 700s, right? But basically, does the property pay for itself? And they'll lend based on that. Really cool. I've done a couple of those recently, and it's very helpful, again, if you're in that entrepreneurial, self-employed world where you're not showing a ton of income. You can also get a lot of those with like the local banks, right? And then it talks about portfolio loans here. I have a cool story there. So I bought this single family home at an auction back in 2018, got a great deal, had tons of equity in it. And I wanted to buy a double. It hit the market. It was an on-market deal, and I wanted to buy it. And I emailed the guy at the bank that I'd been working with, and I said, hey, man, look, this is probably a stupid question, right? But I have a ton of equity in this property. Can I use that equity as the down payment for this and put it all into one loan? And I almost didn't send the email because I thought that was the stupidest idea you could ever conceive of. I was pretty new, or a couple of years in, but I'd never heard of anything like that, right? So I sent him an email, and his response was, hey, Mike, yep, that's called a portfolio loan. We do those all the time. So something that I thought was completely asinine was perfectly normal. So we did a portfolio loan, and it worked out exactly that way. I had just enough equity in that house to be the down payment into the second one. They wrapped it all up into one bow, one nice loan, and I held that for a while until rates dropped and we refinanced them all. So I say all that to say, even within banks, there's probably some creative stuff that you've never heard of, but ask the question. And that's where on the last one we talked about networking. Networking is so important because you want to get in, you want to talk to those lenders, you want to talk to those bank asset managers, right? You want to talk to those people, have the conversation and say, hey, here's my situation. Do you have a product that works? And if you talk to enough of them, you're going to find a yes, right? Unless, all right, hey, look, if your credit score is like 300, maybe not, but like within reason, if you talk to enough lenders, you will find a product that works, okay? Moving on. Short term, this could be hard money. It could be private money. And that chat put private money here. It really should be here, right? But look, this is very different, very valuable when it's needed, right? We pivoted to this maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I absolutely love it. So we still do a bunch of these. I still have loans that were an original owner-occupied loan. I have traditional. I still have some DSCR loans, right? But we've been doing a ton of private money lending where it's just, there are hard money lenders that operate more like banks, right? And I've only dealt with those maybe once, but I love the private money where there's a person who says, Mike, I know and I trust you. I have this money sitting in a savings account making 2% interest or maybe even less. I would rather give it to you and let you put it to work, right? So look, we typically pay those guys like 12% interest on those loans, right? But the benefit, so that the benefit for them is very clear, right? They're not going to get 12% anywhere else. It's backed by real estate. So God forbid the deal goes sideways or I lose my mind or get hit by a bus, they have real estate to take back, right? And it's a personal guarantee. So if the deal goes sideways, I still owe them the loan plus the interest, right? So they're covered, they're protected. The benefit for them is obvious, right? They're getting a great return. The benefit for me is that I can make a phone call and say, hey, so-and-so just bought this deal. The seller needs to close quick, or we bought it in an auction. I need 150 grand today, right? By the end of the business day today. And we can make that happen. I don't know of a bank on earth that can make that happen, right? And look, you can even put these puzzle pieces together, right? We've done deals where I said, hey, private lender, I need this money at the end of this week to close this deal. And then we rehab it, fix it up, decide not to flip it, keep it, and we turn around and put it into a DSCR loan or a traditional loan, right? So you can kind of stack these. Again, short-term loans, they're great for what they're for, right? Quick, easy money, but it is expensive, right? Your holding costs are going to add up quick. So if you're like doing the work yourself and you're going to take 6 months on this cosmetic rehab, that's probably not the route you want to go, right? Because you're burning money very, very quickly that way. Again, there are hard money lenders that operate more like traditional banks, and they'll be upfront points and fees. In my experience, they're good, but not as fast as the private lenders, right? But still a great option. Then this last one here is creative financing. And look, this could be a whole 40-part series on that, right? And there's tons of stuff that's not included in there. But it is there, right? Whether it's seller financing, whether it's bond for deed, whether it's a seller carryback and second, or assuming the current loan, there are a ton of different creative ways. If that's what you're into, look, I am not an expert, admittedly, right? I'll tell you where I am and where I am not an expert. I've done a handful of bond for deeds on both sides as a buyer and seller, and it's worked well, with the exception of one we're working through right now. But look, that is really great. If you say, hey, listen, I don't have the credit, I don't have the income or the cash, I can't get any of these, it is something I think to look at. Look, some people do it in front of all these, right? Some people who can get private money, traditional DSCR, prefer to do creative finance, right? But look, it is its own different world. There's a lot that goes into it. You really need to be smart. Highly recommend Courtney Fricky if you're not following her. If you're interested in creative finance, go ahead and follow her. She has some phenomenal content. I won't pretend to be an expert, but it is a strategy, right? All right. So, and then last thing here, as we start to land the plane on the financing side is, look, there is no best, right? This is going to be case by case, depending on your personal circumstances on what's going to be best. But here are all of the kind of considerations, I'll say, right? how fast do you need the money? How much cash do you have? What rate are you looking for? What conditions the property in? Because like I can tell you right now, if the property's in rough shape, it's going to be a lot harder to get. It's going to be a lot harder to get an owner occupied loan, right? Much, much harder. Now, look, the first double we ever bought was an FHA loan, and it was in horrible shape. And we did an FHA 203K loan, which is their renovation rehab loan. And it worked out great, but it was a huge pain in the rear. I'm sorry, I don't think I would do it again today because it was so much of a pain. And I had a buddy of mine who was a contractor who was kind of helping facilitate. If not for that, I can't even imagine going through that process. So condition matters a lot. Again, do you qualify, or what type of loan do you qualify, and what's your exit strategy? This might arguably be the most important one, right? If you're doing a flip and it's a cosmetic flip, right? We're doing one right now. We're probably in and out. We bought it, rehabbed it, and are going to close within like 3 to 4 months. It's a no-brainer for private money, right? Just a no-brainer. It doesn't make sense to get a bank in and delay everything and all that stuff. But if this is something you're going to buy and hold for 5, 10, 15 years, you're probably not wanting to pay 12%, right? So I think your exit strategy is really going to determine where we look. But all of these are super important, right? So just some things to consider. I think this is kind of the menu of options, so to speak. But again, very, very, very situation dependent, individual dependent, and deal dependent, right? So you're going to need to look at what you have and what resources and options you have, and then pick the financing that's the right plug, right? I think when you're traveling, the outlets aren't the same everywhere, right? You can't just bring your normal hair dryer, right, and plug it in France or Italy or wherever. You kind of need to make sure, see what's there, right? See what you have in the wall and find the right plug. And I think it's the same exact thing here with financing. So I hope that helps clarify kind of the financing situation. But if I have to leave you with one thing in this video, it's you do not need 20%, right? 20% helps. If you are the person who says, I want to invest in real estate because I have a boatload of money sitting here and I want to park it somewhere that's going to appreciate and generate cash flow, hey, perfect. Go get some traditional loans or some DSCR loans. Put 20% down. Don't bother with the time and energy of doing all the creative stuff and just rock and roll, right? But if you're the person starting out who says, hey, I have some cash, I'm pretty limited, then, I think the biggest myth that I want to dispel is you do not need 20% to invest in real estate, right? Again, I've bought and sold a lot of real estate. I have never put 20% down. So that's it. Feel free, drop a comment if you have a question. Drop something in the comments. You can shoot me a message, text, email, whatever. But I hope this helps somebody. You guys have a great day.